After discussing the urban legends of the Hookman and the dead boyfriend at length, now we flip the pages decades back to try to figure out who was actually killing couples out on dirt roads. So follow me back to the corkboard, and let's follow the red string. If we try to find the Hookman by name, our first suspect comes from folklorist Bill Ellis, who suggests that the publicity given to Carl Chessman may have, in the very least, influenced the Hookman legend. In 1940s California, Chessman would pull up next to another car at a red light, pretending to be a police officer. If this facade was enough to convince the driver to comply with his demands, Chessman would commit armed robbery. But this wouldn't satiate him for long. Twice he forced women to leave the car and perform for him. Naturally, a wildfire of panic would blaze through LA until he was arrested in 1948. He was eventually executed in 1960, his name and face becoming the textbook representation of a perverted sadist. Now, this is all horrifying, but outside of a man attacking people in cars, there doesn't seem to be much connection to the urban legend. But hang on. As it turns out, Chessman had been in an accident as a child, which had facially disfigured him. From that day on, he carried the unfortunate nickname Hooknose. So while the story of the Hookman predates Chessman, his nickname, crimes, and well-publicized title stoked the fires of belief in the Hookman legend. While I'm sure Chessman influenced the popularity of the urban legend, I'm not convinced that he's the Hookman. So, who else is on the board? Over in 1930s England, Frank Mitchell began his life of crime as early as the age of 9, when he stole another kid's bike. As time went on, he was hard to miss, and for more than just his behavior. Apparently, he was a huge man, and, according to the 2000 true crime book The Craze, he'd show off his strength by picking up 2 grown men, or he'd wrap his arms around a grand piano and lift it off the floor. And maybe it would have stayed just a neat parlor trick, if he didn't have anger issues. His record included burglary, general violence, slashing a guard's face, being a riot ringleader, and eventually attempted murder. He was sent to a psychiatric hospital until he escaped with another prisoner. When he was tracked down, he wielded 2 meat cleavers against the police. When he escaped yet again, he used an axe to hold a married couple hostage. This would earn him the name the Mad Axeman, though not to be confused with the Mad Axemen of New Orleans. He spent 18 of his 32 years imprisoned. However, he was never actually a convicted murderer or rapist. While at Dartmoor Prison, the governor seemed to realize that throwing Mitchell in jail over and over, allowing his jailers to birch him, was only toughening him up. Birching was a common form of punishment for centuries, particularly in prisons. A prisoner would have their hands tied over their head and be struck with a rod or a set of branches. Sometimes they brought out a cat-o'-nine-tails. Trying to physically punish Mitchell wasn't working, so they tried something new: restricted freedom. Mitchell was allowed to work outside of the prison in open moorland, and they found he had a talent for taming wild ponies. He'd wander into town to have a drink or two, even having an affair with a local schoolmistress. And the kinder treatment did change Mitchell's behavior. He didn't seem to be nearly as unpredictably volatile. But at the same time, Mitchell was allowed a risky amount of freedom, able to come and go mostly as he pleased. On December 12, 1966, Frank Mitchell enacted a plan that had been created and orchestrated by the East End gangsters, the Cray twins. Mitchell asked for permission to go feed some of the Moore's ponies, which was granted. He walked down to Princeton Road, climbed into a green Vauxhall car that was waiting for him, and was driven off to London. What happened to him after that isn't very clear, as multiple theories were suggested. But the point is, he, or his body, was never found. So, Chessman had the right look, as well as being a sadist. And Mitchell had the right background, that of an escaped mentally unstable prisoner. Maybe the two of them together could patch together a Hookman, but it's still not enough. Well, you know me. I've saved the most convincing for last. But for that, we'll have to wander down to a little town called Texarkana to try to study the footprints of possibly the most significant true crime case when it comes to urban legends. In the northeastern border of Texas, or the southwestern edge of Arkansas, is a little town called Texarkana. The name is a shorthand for two separate political entities that spill across the border, Texarkana, Texas, and Texarkana, Arkansas. Each of these cities has its own mayor, government, police, and fire departments. However, at the time of our story, crime ran rampant between both of these twin cities. But life trudged on, tiptoeing around these episodes of violence, until a series of brutal attacks held the cities hostage and attracted national attention. This nightmare starts with a tall, bespectacled 25-year-old Jimmy Hollis and a petite 19-year-old brunette, Mary Jean Larry. When these two met, they were both married, though not to each other. They'd both had wartime marriages, but in post-World War II, 1946, neither of their relationships were working out. It was after both of their marriages had dissolved that Jimmy and Mary Jean started dating. Jimmy asked Mary Jean to see the 1946 film Three Strangers at the Paramount Theater as a double date with his younger brother Bob and his date Virginia. In an America so recently ravaged by war, people flocked to the movies for some escapism, donning their best dresses and coats. After the movie, Jimmy drove them all to a drive-in cafe in his gray Chevrolet. They sipped drinks and chatted, until Jimmy drove Bob and Virginia home. But Jimmy and Mary Jean would drive to Richmond Road, pulling off onto a dirt lane to park. The moon wasn't yet up, but it was pleasantly cool out, a nice breeze coaxing the branches to sway. They talked in the near-total darkness, Jimmy even singing to her, drawing on his experience with a Fort Worth dance band. A simple night, full of simple pleasures. A movie, time with friends, a soda or two, a chat with your date, and a song. Hollis got out of the car to look for stars. As he peered up into the sky, he was blinded by a powerful flashlight that shone from about 20 feet away. Squinting, Hollis thought he could see... Is that the barrel of a gun? A man's voice told him to take off his pants. Hollis didn't recognize the voice, so he called out, quote, "Fellow, you've got me mixed up with someone else. You've got the wrong man." The voice responded, quote, "I don't want to kill you, fellow, so you better do what I tell you. Take off your goddamn pants now." In the car, Mary Jean begged Jimmy to just do it. Hollis was taking off one pant leg when the stranger walked forward and cracked the pistol's barrel across his head. Another strike sent his glasses flying. As he crumpled to the ground, the man viciously kicked at him with metal cleats. The man struck Hollis again, so hard that Mary Jean thought he'd been shot. It wasn't a gunshot. It was Hollis's skull cracking. Mary Jean got out of the car, scrambling to Hollis's trousers and fumbling to get his billfold out of his pocket. "Look, he doesn't have any money." "You're lying." "No, look, you can see." "Where's your purse?" "I don't have one." The man struck her in the head with what felt like an iron pipe. Stumbling to her feet, the man said, quote, "Take off. Run." She did the best that her high heels would allow. She could hear Hollis groaning, redirecting the man's attention back to his first victim. Mary Jean could hear him beating Jimmy as she ran. Then the thug was after her, like the predator he was. "What the hell are you running for?" "You told me to run. You're a goddamn liar." the next strike opened a wound on her scalp. I'm going to redact some of what this monster did, skipping ahead to when Mary Jean screamed at him to, quote, "Go ahead and kill me." For some reason that the couple couldn't understand, the man turned around and left. After thinking on it for several days, Mary Jean reached the conclusion that an approaching pair of headlights must have frightened him off. As soon as he was gone, Mary sprinted for the road, thinking only of getting help for Jimmy. She slammed on the first door she came to, begging for the sheriff. Meanwhile, poor Jimmy was coming sluggishly to consciousness. Rubbing the congealed blood from his eyes, he concentrated on getting to Richmond Road and getting help. I don't know how, and I can't imagine the pain it must have cost. But Jimmy staggered to his feet, making his way towards the gravel road. When he fell, he crawled. A car pulled up next to him, and Jimmy begged for help. The driver, with what little humanity he possessed on full display, yelled at Jimmy that he was going to get blood in his car. The motorist told him that he'd call for an ambulance on the nearest telephone. An ambulance took Hollis to Texarkana Hospital near downtown. Mary Jean came out of the house she'd sought shelter in just in time to catch a ride with a policeman. Jimmy's skull had been fractured in 3 places, and Mary Jean required 8 stitches to close her own head wound. When the police spoke to Hollis, he said, quote, "I think he is a young white man, not over 30 years old, and he's desperate." However, when they spoke to Mary Jean, she said she was almost certain the man had been black, but that he was wearing a white mask over his head with holes cut out for eyes and mouth. One source says she thought this because of how the man pronounced the words and insults he threw at them. Hollis hadn't seen a mask, but then again, he'd been blinded by the flashlight. And frankly, who knows how much of both of their serious head wounds impacted their recollection of the night's events. For a long while, the police thought that they both, though particularly Mary Jean, might be hiding the identity of their attacker. Why? I have no idea, and the sources I used didn't seem to have any reason either. But eventually, it was concluded that, in her panic, she quite possibly could have seen an illusion of a hood or halo because of the strong flashlight. Life after the attack was always going to be difficult in a way that most people around them would never be able to understand. Because most of the attack had focused on Jimmy's head, most of the scars could be covered by his hair, except for the scar of a gash that went up the left side of his forehead and into his hairline. A permanent reminder that he'd see in the mirror every day. He moved to Shreveport, Louisiana. In late spring, Hollis visited Mary Jean in Oklahoma for a week. They found camaraderie in recounting the events and emotions of that night to each other. They explored the possibility of getting together in the long run, but that week proved that there was just too much residual trauma between them both to overcome. The trauma settled in their bones, built itself into their behaviors. When Hollis and his future wife went out for target practice in the woods, they heard a gunshot in the distance. Quote, "Without a word, Hollis reacted as if he were alone, turning immediately and sprinting back to his parked car. She ran after him. He was already inside and turning the key before she caught up with him and got into the car as it was rolling." He'd never told her about the Texarkana nightmare etched indelibly in his psyche. But the monster prowling the lovers' lanes of Texarkana wasn't satisfied with one traumatized couple. The terror of the small dual city was just getting started. Richard Griffin was handsome, with dark auburn hair and freckles. The oldest of 5, he'd managed to get through World War II without even an injury, mostly working in the Navy, patrolling the South Pacific. Returning home, he became enamored with brown-haired, blue-eyed Polly Ann Moore. It didn't seem to matter to him that she was 17 to his 29. Polly and her brother were raised by their mother, who became a widow when Polly was 8. She graduated high school in 1945 at the age of 16 and had a war job as a checker of ammunition at the Red River Ordnance Depot. She'd had little experience of life or the world outside of her small town. Raised to be quiet and studious, she easily caught the attention of Richard. By the time of the incident, they'd been going out for 6 weeks. On the evening of Saturday, March 23rd, Richard took Polly to the Canary Cottage, an all-night restaurant specializing in steak and chicken. Later, they went to the Paramount Theater to see the Columbia comedy Snafu. They went to a cafe after the movie, leaving around 2 a.m. Their last stop took them to a dirt road south of Stockman's Cafe. The road was flanked with willow trees and bushes, the perfect spot for a lover's lane. After a little while, a shadowy figure snuck up to the car. Brandishing a handgun, the stranger echoed the request from Jimmy's attack. He told Griffin to drop his pants as he sat in the car. From the scene of the crime, as well as the events in the last incident, it seems that this request was to restrict the movement of the boy's feet. James Presley, the writer of the 2015 book The Phantom Killer, acknowledges that at this point, we really don't know what happened in any great detail. But what we do know is that whatever mild benevolence the killer had shown to Mary Jean that let her survive their encounter, whatever that had been, was now gone. The gunman shot Richard twice in the back of the head as he sat in the car. Polly was also shot twice, but she'd been brought outside onto a blanket. There was evidence of more happening before her death. The murderer hauled Polly's body into the back seat of the car, arranging her into a sitting position. It was a rainy Sunday on the morning of the 24th. At 9 a.m., a motorist noticed a car, wondering why it was there at that time of day, especially when he could see 2 people inside, unmoving. I don't think it took him very long to determine that something truly awful had happened, between the headshots taken on Richard and the blood soaking the blanket still in the grass. It was truly a gruesome scene to behold. Quote, "The Oldsmobile was spotted throughout with blood. Blood had seeped through the bottom of the car's door and onto the running board, where it had congealed. Griffin's trouser pockets were turned inside out, as if to suggest robbery. Judging from the amount of blood, both inside and outside the car, the killer could hardly have avoided getting blood all over himself as well." Griffin's wallet and driver's license were on the scene, but the girl's identity was more difficult to determine. It was her ring that eventually led her to her family. It was an Atlanta high school class of 1945 ring, with the initials PAM engraved on the inside. Though the police were quick to respond, the curse that is human curiosity arrived faster. People crowded around the car, ogling the deceased couple. Between the rain and the bystanders, any tracks the killer may have left were obliterated. And people continued the pattern of horrific behavior that we've seen many times before. Wellborn Griffin, Richard's brother, even heard cops talking about 2 drunk women who'd been squealing and pushing each other around at the crime scene. One of these women even tried to shove her friend's face into the blood-soaked dirt where the cars and bodies had been. And although the police did show up, their efforts weren't exactly promising. Wellborn went to the police to try to get any information at all. An officer told him that the car's keys were found 100 yards away in the marsh. Wellborn stopped him. "You mean 100 feet, not 100 yards, don't you?" "No, it was 100 yards, because we measured it." Wellborn stared at the officer, incredulous. "I don't believe me, you, or nobody else can throw a set of car keys 100 yards. We can theorize that the keys might not have been thrown that far. Maybe they'd been dropped when the killer fled. But it's concerning that this officer was either mistaken or lying about a very basic fact in regards to this evidence. Quote, had Wellborn Griffin known how the keys were actually found in the dirt by the man cradling a baby girl after the crowd had dispersed, he might have sustained his argument. It was an example of how fast facts became distorted as word-of-mouth accounts changed, sometimes radically and repeatedly. The newspaper article proclaiming "couple found, shot to death in auto" was accompanied by a photo of Griffin and a candid photo of Polly sitting on her home's front steps with her dog. Hauntingly, they'd gotten her photo for this article from inside her purse, next to her body. Despite the gruesome tragedy of the situation, the general citizens of Texarkana weren't exactly worried, as the two drunk women demonstrated. Crime wasn't exactly rare to Texarkana at the time, so this was treated more as a shocking one-off. It was easier to shrug aside because Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry survived their encounter. I'm also assuming that the police withheld details about their attack from the public to preserve the traumatized pair's privacy. Some of the public were even tossing around the theory that the killer must have known the couple and killed them out of revenge or jealousy. What the revenge was for, or what the jealousy was about, no one knew. And it didn't really seem to matter to the people who chatted about the brutal murders while getting a drink. But the time for easy dismissals was rapidly coming to a close. On Friday, April 12th, 16-year-old James Paul Martin, who went by Paul, asked to borrow his brother's Ford coupe. When World War II had descended, Paul's three brothers answered the summons to fight in the war. But Paul was too young, so he attended a Mississippi military school during the last year of the war. When the war ended, he returned to Kilgore High and worked as a part-timer in an ice plant, eventually being promoted to the plant's night engineer, again at 16. Paul had grown up with Betty Jo Booker, going all the way back to elementary school on the Arkansas side of the Texarkana line. Betty Jo Booker was a 15-year-old junior and a saxophone player in the local orchestra. Her life hadn't been an easy one. In 1932, her father and several others were checking on some relatives in northern Louisiana after a deadly tornado had killed 8 people. The group was in a traffic accident, and her father's skull was fractured, killing him at just 30 years old. Betty Jo was only 3 at the time. Her older brother, Billy Boy, had been born with brain damage and never developed a mental capacity beyond that of a young child. He died in a Little Rock institution when he was just 16. Betty Jo countered all of this tragedy by putting her energy into creative extracurriculars. She was a swimmer and a dancer, performing song and dance numbers at civic groups, singing in church. She picked up the saxophone and participated in a few band groups, maintaining friends on both sides of the state lines. Paul set out to pick up Betty Jo for a date, but she'd gone swimming with a friend. Paul stuck around at the Booker household, catching up with the family he'd known for years. Later that night, Betty Jo played in the band, the last song being "Good Night, Sweetheart."
Good night, sweetheart, till we meet tomorrow. Good night, sweetheart, sleep will banish sorrow.
Wrapping up after 1 a.m. Paul waited outside the building, knowing that Betty Jo was going to be a hot minute, between putting instruments and sheet music away and being paid for their performance. Betty Jo and her friend Betty Ann Roberts walked to the car. Paul took her saxophone case, putting it gently down on the back floorboard. They were still intending to go to a group slumber party, but first things first. She needed to drop her expensive instrument off at home. On their way back to her house, he suggested they take a detour to Spring Lake Park. Spring Lake Park was, and is, a popular recreation area for Texarkana residents. Quote, "The park was a popular family venue, featuring a dance pavilion along with the eponymous body of water, with its own resident alligator. People from surrounding areas visited the spring house to fill jugs with its water, believed to harbor healthful constituents." Author James Presley also explains that Texarkana's first known act of violence happened in this idyllic park. Quote, "In 1541, so the story went, the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto quelled a mutiny by hanging a soldier from a tree in what was to become the park." Paul and Betty had been parked for a while when another car drove up. A man holding a pistol strolled over to the driver's side of the teen's car. A few neighborhoods away, Betty Jo's mother, Bessie, woke up. Looking around the house, she saw an empty space where her daughter's saxophone case usually stood. Betty Jo hadn't come home. Just before 6 in the morning, Mr. and Mrs. Weaver, along with their son, were on the beginning of a day trip to visit relatives, driving along North Park Road around the park. But there was something lying at the edge of the unpaved road. A body. The boy, in a light-colored long-sleeved shirt, was lying on his left side, his legs jutting into the dirt road. The Weavers drove 200 yards to the nearest home to alert the sheriff's office. This time, when the police located the scene, 2 men stood guard to ward away any curious bystanders, not allowing people to work themselves into a circus. They preserved every footprint they could that surrounded the scene. The police pulled out the boy's wallet, its contents reading Paul Martin. He'd been shot through the back of his neck, the bullet exiting through the front of his skull. Another shot went through his back and into his left shoulder. A third bullet pierced his right hand. The fourth found a home in the boy's face. Quote, "Blood was seen on the other side of the road by a fence, indicating that he might have been shot on one side of the road and crawled across." Martin's coupe was found about a mile away, along the road parallel to the Kansas City Southern tracks and crossing, the keys still in the ignition. In the bushes, Sheriff Presley found a small date book that belonged to Paul. He decided to quietly slip it into his suit coat pocket, not telling anyone he'd found it. He'd also seen a condom nearby, but didn't bother picking it up. In a time before DNA evidence, there was no way to determine who had used it or when, and it wasn't exactly uncommon to find used condoms on lovers' lanes. They'd found Paul, as well as several items belonging to him. But where was Betty Jo? They found her behind some trees in a rougher part of the underbrush, a few yards off the lane. She lay on her back in a full-length coat, a blouse, a plaid skirt, and patent leather shoes. The coat was buttoned up almost entirely, and her right hand was tucked into the pocket. In the crime scene photos, they both look like they're sleeping. Betty Jo, in particular, almost looks like she'd been stargazing in the grass. But their injuries don't allow for such illusions. Betty Jo had been shot once in the heart and once in the head, a bullet entering her left cheek near her nose. Quote, "The angle of the bullets, on cursory examination, suggested the gunman had been right-handed and had faced her as he killed her. It wasn't much of a clue." Her peaceful pose and meticulously arranged clothes were also in contrast with the FBI findings that she'd been sexually assaulted prior to death. I can't help but wonder, what was different about Betty Jo to the killer? The rest of the victims showed signs of, or reported experiencing, extraordinary violence and were left in varying states of disarray. But Betty Jo was clearly repositioned, her clothes neatly arranged. Was it because of her young age, being just 15 years old? Was it guilt? I'm not sure. The police took note that Paul and Betty Jo were left on full display to anyone who came by, even though Betty Jo was further into the trees. Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore weren't hidden in the sense that they were hidden from sight, but that they were positioned into a disguise to look like sleepy travelers. The police concluded that the killer's methods had evolved, his anxiety fading into a reckless abandon, now unconcerned with his victims being discovered. The public started to panic. As violent as the first attack had been, the first pair had survived. The second pair, the towns brushed off as a personal hit. But this? There was no way for the general public to see it as anything else than a maniac on the loose. The Kansas City Star writes, quote, "Lights burn in every home all night long. Porch lights and special spotlights illuminate every street. Special delivery mail carriers and messenger boys refuse to deliver letters or telegrams after dark because too many bullets have been singing through the air at the approach of a man towards a house at night." Photographs of the victims ran in the papers, but Paul's always confused me. His photo looks like a 10-year-old kid paired with the photo of a 15-year-old. I'd wondered if he just looked really youthful. But I finally have the answer why. For some reason, the photo the paper ran was taken 4 years before, so Paul is actually a 12-year-old in the photo. As young as Betty Jo was, Paul wasn't much older. He would have turned 17 in 3 weeks. Quote, "One classmate remembered him as a short boy with the best attitude you ever saw. I don't think he had an enemy in the world. Everybody loved him, and he just loved people." He was buried in Hillcrest Cemetery beside his father, in a spot next to where his mother would eventually lay. Betty Jo's photo was said to be, quote, "not quite typical of her face and appearing older than her 15 years. It was the photo she'd given her friends in the Delta Beta Sigma sorority. Texas senior high classes were dismissed at noon so that students could attend Betty Jo's funeral, the school's choral group singing hymns. She was laid to rest in Woodlawn Cemetery, beside her father and brother, all three having passed far before their time. Virgil and Katie Starks were a married couple that kept a 500-acre farm in the Hookman County of Miller County, Arkansas, about 10 miles northeast of Arcana. Both 36, they'd known each other their entire lives. They'd been happily married for 14 years. A side note that the book The Phantom Killer said that Katie was 36, but numerous newspapers say that she was 30. I'm not entirely sure. Their white frame farmhouse was comfortable and spacious, having 6 rooms and small porches at front and back. Neatly trimmed shrubs surrounded the house on the front and sides. When you entered the front door, there was a living room on the left and a bedroom on the right. There was a middle room before you hit the kitchen and dining area in the back, the middle portion having an oak-paneled sitting room with an easy chair, a radio, and a telephone with a hand crank ringer on the wall. All of this detail is to help give context for what happens. Friday, May the 3rd, had been a long day of work. Katie was putting dishes away, and Virgil sat in his easy chair with a heating pad on his back. Mid-30s and manual labor gets to us all. Darkness had fallen, but it was cozy in their farmhouse, the radio playing softly. 2 gunshots shattered the peace of the Starks' home forever. Virgil silently slumped forward in his chair, the blood-splattered newspaper falling to the floor. One of the bullets went through the heating pad, short-circuiting it. Katie heard the sound of tinkling glass, so she assumed Virgil had dropped something. She walked into the sitting room and saw her husband slumped forward, a pool of blood under the chair and 2 holes in the window pane. She hurried to his side, lifting his head, seeing the love of her life was already gone. She sprinted for the hand-crank telephone, but 2 more bullets hit their mark. Quote, "One bullet entered her cheek, beside her nose, and emerged from behind the ear. The other shot entered her lower jaw, just below the lip. The shots crashed through her teeth, scattering fragments to the floor. The bullet striking her right cheek had emerged from behind the left ear. The bullet to her jaw had broken the lower jaw and lodged under her tongue. She slammed to the floor, miraculously still alive. Despite 2 bullets having hurtled through her skull, she somehow had the presence of mind to stay on the floor. She reasoned that if the killer didn't see her rise again from his position outside, that maybe he'd assume he'd killed her. On her hands and knees, she inched her way to the back of the house. Once out of sight, she went back into the bedroom to fetch their .45 revolver in the dresser drawer, though she wasn't exactly sure where it was. And despite how collected she'd been so far, make no mistake, she was incredibly disoriented and in physical agony. Blood was still spraying from her wounds, half blinding her. She fumbled through the bedroom. Should she risk spending the time searching for the gun? Should she write a note? What it should say, she wasn't quite sure, but she needed to leave something behind if she didn't make it. As she entered the kitchen, she saw a man's leg and knee as he clambered into the house via a window to the screened-in back porch. Terror overtook her. She half ran, half stumbled through the bedroom, through a passageway, into another bedroom, through the living room, and finally to the front door. She sprinted down the driveway into the night, dressed only in a gore-coated nightgown. Barefoot, she crossed the highway and then the railroad tracks. She staggered to the house of her sister, Betty Allen, and her brother-in-law, Jeff Allen. But her heart dropped when she realized there was no light on in the house, and nothing stirred when she screamed and banged on the door. It was all too much, too painful in so many ways. The Praters. With her last hope for survival being 50 yards away at the Praters' home, she rallied one more time. And thank God they were home. Recognizing Katie immediately and seeing her covered in blood, Prater seized his rifle and fired it into the sky, a rallying cry to all the neighbors in the area. Neighbor Elmer Taylor leapt into action, driving to the Prater house. The group eased Katie into the front seat of Taylor's truck, the Praters and their baby taking the back. Taylor sped to the Michael Mager Hospital just east of the state line. Probably delusional with pain, Katie handed Taylor one of her molars that had a gold filling. Payment for this nightmarish car ride. It was one of the teeth that had been dislodged by the bullets. She'd spat the tooth into her hand and just held it in her fist the entire time. When the physicians took a look at her, they were surprised she could talk at all. She had teeth missing, her jaw was broken, and that bullet was still lodged under her tongue. Quote, while the doctor was amazed she hadn't bled to death, even more striking was that her pulse was normal, no evidence of shock. What a badass. The lights were still on in the farmhouse when the troopers entered, guns drawn. Mr. Starks was slumped in his blood-soaked chair, which was smoldering due to the short-circuited heating pad. Smoke filled the air. Muddy footprints and blood covered the floor. But the scene soon became way too crowded. Lawmen from both sides of the state line, from as far as 30 miles away, descended on the scene. You'd think that so many cops would mean a well-preserved crime scene. Yeah, you'd think that. But instead, all of these officers were so worked up to be a part of the investigation that they literally stomped out most of the evidence. Tempers flared as they got in each other's way. Awesome. An unprecedented, fresh crime scene that could help them solve the murders of multiple people, and seemingly no one decided to put that intention over their own egos. What they could determine was that the attacker had crouched in the bushes outside the window that Virgil had been sitting in front of. He pointed his .22 automatic at Virgil, the gun just 18 to 20 inches from the window pane, and fired 2 bullets into the back of Virgil's head. A lawman later stated, quote, a 6-year-old could have hit a target from that distance. The officers felt that the shots could have come from a rifle, but it would have made a different shot pattern. They couldn't be sure that it wasn't the .22 pistol. A red flashlight had been dropped under the hedge, or possibly placed on the ground so the killer could make the shot. No money had been taken. Katie's purse lay on the bed undisturbed, with both money and jewels inside. As author James Presley points out, quote, "This did not necessarily mean the intruder hadn't intended to rob the house and its owners. If so, his plan apparently had gone awry the moment Katie ran to the telephone. From that point, the killer apparently concentrated his efforts on eliminating her and, that failing, on escaping himself. If he had simply wanted to kill Starks and nothing else, he had ample time to shoot and run immediately, but he had lingered until she had appeared." To quote the Bowie County Sheriff, quote, "This killer is the luckiest person I have ever known. No one sees him, hears him in time, or can identify him in any way." The town was in uproar after the farmhouse killing. While the majority of the murders happened on quiet roads and very late at night, now the killer was walking up to an upstanding citizen's window and assassinating him. As the May 5th edition of the Cincinnati Gazette states, quote, "Although stunned by the previous murders, they had felt that they were safe at home. After last night's slaying, the Texarkana Gazette said, there is a feeling that even at home, with the blinds drawn, there is no safety from the murderer." It was so bad that a local baseball game had unusually large attendance because everyone was terrified to stay at home. Servers stopped coming to work, too hysterical to risk going in. I was taken aback when I found an article from the May 12th issue of the San Angelo Standard-Times. Apparently, there were gangs of young people who were going out as novice sleuths, trying to track down the murderer. Quote, "Some were reported to be actually trailing persons they suspected, and others planted themselves as decoys to lure the killer into another attack. And a good number of these kids were armed, parking on dark country roads, particularly on the roads where the other teens had been killed, and waiting for the Phantom to try to kill them. A prominent high school athlete got in trouble because he was trailing a bus. When a cop tried to pull over this athlete, the boy panicked. This led to a 3-mile chase, ending with the cops shooting out his tires. But the care, concern, and caution had arrived after the tidal wave of death had passed, for the Phantom Killer was done with Texarkana. As a side note, the mutilated body of Earl Cliff McSpadden was found on railroad tracks 16 miles south of Texarkana, and was discussed as a potential victim. I got hung up on just how much the Phantom's methods would have had to deviate for this murder. And sure enough, McSpadden's death was eventually dismissed as a phantom victim. The attacks on the Starks would be the last chance the police would have to investigate a new crime scene. But with so many officers on the case, a few crime scenes, and some physical evidence, surely they could find some good suspects. The main suspect was ex-con Ewell Swinney. Swinney and his new wife, a sex worker named Peggy, had been arrested for stealing cars. While being questioned, Peggy told police that her husband was the killer, but she refused to sign an official statement. In the end, there was no physical evidence connecting Swinney to the murders, and the police only had an unofficial accusation by his wife. The case fell apart before it could even vaguely come together. But in the newspaper article that reported this unverified claim, further down in the paper was an ad for a movie titled The Phantom Speaks. Through a combination of the police investigation and this movie ad, they finally had a name for their boogeyman, the Phantom. This name would expand to the Phantom Killer, the Phantom of Texarkana, and the Phantom Slayer, the murders themselves gaining the name the Texarkana Moonlight Murders. Penn State professor Bill Ellis explains, quote, "One of the roles that urban legends play, and this is an ancient function, is that they will put a name on something that gives people fears or anxieties. That gives the person some feeling of control. So give the murderer a name. He's the Phantom Murderer." Decades later, a film would be made about these crimes, and of course we'll talk about it. Documentarians were brought to the house where the film was made, and in their conversation, one said, quote, "Ewell Swinney would have been easy to pin it on, and they needed to pin it on somebody." One person that I haven't been satisfied he was cleared was a young man that committed suicide and left a note saying that he was the Phantom Killer. It's just part of the legend, the son of a prominent family, and it had the connections to, cover up his dirty deed. I went looking for this confession and came across an article from The Sun in 1948. The note came from student H.B. Tennyson, but Tennyson was 17. At the time of the murder, he'd have been 15 years old. Now, it's not impossible for a 15-year-old to kill, but the idea of a 15-year-old getting away with multiple murders? And then there's Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larey. Unless Tennyson was just a huge kid, I think the victims would have mentioned that they'd been beaten by a 15-year-old. Former probation officer and investigator of the Phantom case, Mark Bledsoe, interviewed Swinney years later. The documentary specifically said May 3, 1994. In this interview, Swinney denied that he'd even been at Spring Lake Park, and that he wasn't the killer. And from everything I've found, other than the police saying that his wife made an unofficial claim once, I don't really see anything compelling to suggest Swinney had anything to do with the murders. And from what we've heard, the police weren't exactly looking like heroes. Numerous attacks, a handful of dead civilians, a few being children, horrifically botched crime scenes, and no one to point the finger at to distract from their own incompetence. Swinney seems like a half-baked attempt at an easy solution for the police. An article printed in the May 4th, 1946 edition of the Corpus Christi Times reads, quote, "Authorities said that since the first double murder to have had, quote, only one hot suspect, and he washed out. He was arrested at Corpus Christi after trying to sell a saxophone similar to Miss Booker's, which was missing after the slaying." This really must not have gone anywhere, because I couldn't find anything else about this hot suspect. Or maybe they're referring to Swinney. The May 8th paper of the Cincinnati Enquirer reads, quote, "The Texarkana Gazette quoted Dr. Anthony LaPalla, psychiatrist at the Federal Correctional Institution here, as saying he believed the same person was responsible for the 5 deaths, that the man was middle-aged, was a sadist, and was motivated by a strong sex drive." Not particularly helpful. The May 23rd print of the Corpus Christi Times mentions that a 21-year-old ex-Army Air Force gunner named Ralph B. Bauman was taken in by the LA police. Acting on a telephone tip, a policeman had arrested Bauman at a shooting gallery, even as he still held the rifle that he'd just shot his 23rd consecutive bullseye. Bauman definitely seemed to have some mental health struggles, and they were bad enough that he was dismissed from the Air Force a year before because of them, according to the paper. The FBI report on the Texarkana murders records that Bauman said he'd been in a psychiatric hospital in 1938. According to Bauman, he'd gone into a coma, not remembering anything that had happened from March 25th until he woke up May 3rd, by which time the hunt for the killer was underway. A quote from Bauman includes, quote, "I've been in a coma, running from something, maybe murder. I want to clear it up. If I didn't kill 5 people in Texarkana, I want to settle down and be a stuntman in Hollywood. I'm happiest when I'm living in danger." He certainly didn't seem to understand or appreciate the gravity of the situation. The FBI report goes on to elaborate that Bauman stayed in the woods on the outskirts of Texarkana, but he couldn't remember if he'd stayed in a room at any point, or even what he ate while he was in the area. When he woke up on May 3rd, he wondered what he'd been doing in town for a month. Bauman made a number of statements that just didn't make sense. This included confessing that he killed 3 people in Texarkana in 3 days, which didn't line up with the timeline of the killings. All in all, from what I've read, Bauman just seems like a very mentally disturbed young man, roaming around in a country that didn't know how to help him. There were several other people occasionally mentioned, but none of the investigations into them went far enough for me to talk about here. "30 years later, in 1976, a film based on the Texarkana Moonlight Murders hit the big screens. The Town That Dreaded Sundown is argued to be one of the first slasher films ever, predating Halloween by 2 years, quietly influencing cinematic boogeymen for generations to come. It's the interpretation of these crimes through this film that cemented the crimes into the pop culture of national American history. So, naturally, I had to take a look for myself. The movie's shot more like a documentary than a film, the first lines of dialogue describing the political and social climate of the time. At just over 2 minutes in, the narrator sets the stage.
It was Sunday, March 3rd, 1946. The beginning of a reign of terror for the people of Texarkana and surrounding areas of Arkansas and Texas. A terror so indelibly imprinted that today, 30 years later, people still speak of it fearfully. The incredible story you are about to see is true. Where it happened and how it happened. Only the names have been changed.
True to where it happened and how it happened. Only the names have been changed. Now look, we've seen a lot of movies by now that say based on a true story. But this movie doesn't even say that, or inspired by a true story. No, it claims to be true to what happened, other than the names. If you're gonna make a movie essentially recreating very real crimes, I'm gonna hold that to a higher standard. And I'll level with you. I was watching minute by minute, scouring for almost any accuracy. There's so much they got wrong or rewrote that I'm just gonna have to go through the highlights. The first couple is Linda May and Sammy, replacements for Jimmy Hollis and Mary Jean Larry. When they sit in the car on the Lover's Lane, there's no way for this film crew or director to know what exactly Jimmy and Mary Jean said to each other, so they have to make it up. Sure, I get that. But the dialogue they chose paints the real victim, Jimmy Hollis, in a sexually aggressive light. And it sounds incredibly familiar.
Would you sit up?
Damn it, Linda May. Come on.
Sammy, move your hand.
What'd you do that for?
I heard something.
Thank God, Linda May, will you please concentrate on what the hell's going on?
I'm not kidding. I heard something.
Linda May, that is the oldest trick in the book.
Have you got the car doors locked?
Jesus Christ, when I go out with you, I'll never understand. Damn.
We'll unpack that a little later. A man wearing a bag over his head appears at the passenger side window. He swings a bat into the driver's window, yanking Sammy out through it. Blood drips off of the shattered window pane as Linda May screams. For all of their extra flourishes when it came to Sammy being yanked out of the car, the movie doesn't bother to include the killer telling Mary to run, then pursuing and attacking her again. He just climbs into the car, and we fade to black. Cut to morning, and we see Linda May at the side of a road, another inaccuracy. Later, when the police question the doctor says,
I can tell you that her back, stomach, and breasts were heavily bitten.
Bitten?
Literally chewed.
So, that's wildly different, and now viciously editing the victim's story. When Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore were attacked, it had been raining earlier in the day, but had faded by the time they were on the Lover's Lane. The film crew took the raining part of history very seriously. As Griffin and Moore's stand-ins, Howard and Emma Lou, are driving to the Lover's Lane, it's comically obvious that it hadn't been raining the day they filmed. Instead, they put an overlay of rain in front of the footage and tried to darken the incredibly sunny day in an attempt to make it look like night, which works about as well as you'd think. When we get a close-up of the couple in the car, there's what I can only assume is a fire hose shooting water down directly on the roof of the car. The movie has Deputy Norman Ramsey discover their abandoned car, hearing gunshots not long after. So clearly, he's just arrived at the scene of the crime, mere minutes after the killer abducted this couple. The deputy even sees the killer climb into a car to leave, draws his gun at the car, but doesn't fire. He later finds Howard dead in the grass. Emma Lou is nearby, her wrists tied so that she's hugging a tree. The back of her dress dips down to reveal enormous purple bite marks on her back. If you'll remember from earlier in this episode, in the actual case, the couple was killed in and around the car, placed back inside, and was discovered hours later in the morning by a passing motorist, all of which I find way more terrifying than what the movie chose to do. And hey, I might not have found every single detail about this case, but I sure as shit don't remember any mention of bite marks. So that's negative points for the film. Another huge issue with this movie is that it just can't pick a tone. An example of this is when the narrator says that the police are going to set decoys out in the field. We get a lineup of male police officers dressed as women, paraded into the precinct for the sake of comedy, lilting music plunking along in the background. When one of the officers, dressed as a woman, pairs up with another officer in a car, the other officer points out that kids came here to get frisky, so he might have to act up in order to put on a good show. He starts putting his hand around the disguised officer's shoulder, who immediately starts repeating some of the dialogue from the first attack.
What the hell's wrong with you? Watch the hand.
In both scenes, where the person being advanced on says no, they get an exasperated attitude from the man initiating the contact. One due to sexual frustration, the other for comedy. Either way, the film portrays that being told no isn't something to be taken seriously. Jumping ahead, we're taken to a school's prom. We spend a hot minute watching glassy-eyed teens whirl each other around, either desperately trying not to look at the camera or staring directly at it. We also see two chaperones trying to get through the night by putting booze in their drinks. But why are we at a prom anyway? Oh, it's where the movie decided that Betty Jo Booker's recreator, Peggy, now plays the trombone instead of the saxophone. When Peggy and Roy, Paul Martin's replacement, leave, they go to the middle of the woods. They've been there for a while and are just starting to drive away when the killer reaches through the driver's window. The car drives round and round in circles until the killer manages to yank Roy out. Crappy fistfight ensues. Roy tries to stagger away, but is shot in the back for his efforts. And now, we get to the part that I've been dreading, as it's pretty notorious. The killer ties Peggy's wrists so that she's hugging a tree, much like Emma Lou. The killer takes Peggy's trombone out of its case, tying a knife to the end of it. After testing it out a few times, he crouches behind Peggy. And I wish I was kidding. He plays the trombone, stabbing her as he does. And that's how he kills her. What's even more upsetting is that we don't see the impact of the knife, so it's filmed in a way that suggests that he might not be stabbing her in the back. This is inconceivably irresponsible judgment. Betty Jo Booker was 15 years old. 15 years old. And now you've taken what was already the terrifying final moments of her life and created a campy, suggestive death in your supposedly entirely accurate movie, projecting disturbing and humiliating implications onto the real-life victim. The idea of Betty Jo Booker's mother, who'd already lost a husband and son, seeing a representation of her daughter being killed in this way, it's awful to even think about. Not long after this, we have an officer drive full speed down a hill, rocketing into an algae-filled pond for comedy, all while a banjo musical score plays in the background. It feels completely irreverent in such a disrespectful way. We're brought into the house of Lloyd and Helen Reed, this film's version of Virgil and Katie Starks. There isn't a lot to say here, except that the killer has already broken into the house when he shoots Helen. While she scrambles through the kitchen, the killer just stands over the body of her husband, allowing her to noisily escape. We then see the killer pick up a goddamn pickaxe to chase her down with. Helen crawls through cornfields instead of running down the road, probably for the sake of narrative tension. I was curious how they were going to end this movie, since the Starks attack is the last confirmed Phantom incident. What we get is a crappy police chase, on foot, in broad daylight. Well, the hooded killer runs towards an oncoming train. I was shocked. This might take a crazy turn. Why? Remember the body of McSpadden found on the train tracks? Well, here we are, with 10-ish minutes left of the film, the killer approaching an oncoming train. Were they going to have the train hit the murderer, then claiming that McSpadden is the killer? Or would they pick a different name to go along with the fiction? Well, no. The killer gets across the tracks, separating him from the two cops in pursuit. The cops start shooting indiscriminately under the train. For plot contrivement reasons, the murderer runs parallel to the train and is shot in the leg. And then the train passes, and he's gone.
The bloodhounds that were brought in quickly lost the scent in this murky bayou in the vast backwater wilderness of southern Arkansas. Some say of these swamps that most men who go in never come out. But there was little doubt that the Phantom Killer plunged deep into these swamps that late fall of 1946. What happened to the Phantom Killer, no one really knows. Some believe he was convicted of another crime, and today he is still serving his term in a Kansas prison. Some believe he died here in these swamps. Texarkana today still looks pretty much the same. And if you should ask people here on the streets what they believe happened to the Phantom Killer, most would say that he is still living here and is walking free.
This movie came out 30 years after the murders took place. That might sound like a long time, but there were still plenty of people in town, friends, relatives, neighbors, who knew these victims. And now, they had this insultingly inaccurate film about these people they loved, being shown all across America. Mark Melton Moore, the brother of victim Polly Ann Moore, took director Charles Pierce to court in 1978 for $1.3 million for invading his family's privacy. His sister was portrayed as Emma Lou Cook, the girl in the movie who was killed on the sunniest rainy night in history. But he said that the film depicted his sister, quote, as a high school dropout and a woman with loose and low morals, when in fact none of such was true. The court denied his claim in 1979. He filed again in 1980 with the Texas Supreme Court. He was again dismissed. And here's where things get a bit more controversial. Since 2003, the town of Texarkana started an annual tradition of playing The Town That Dreaded Sundown on every Thursday during May and October, becoming a Halloween tradition. They play this movie in Spring Lake Park, where Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker were killed. I'm sure there are people who tell me it's not that deep, especially since it's almost 80 years later. The people involved are most certainly dead. But I don't particularly think that living memory is required to respect the death of 2 kids. Betty Jo's death in particular is recreated as campy and borderline humiliating. Watching that literally within the park where they were killed, it just feels so gross to me. I don't live in Texarkana. I can't take the pulse of how people who live there feel, if the murders feel like a distant memory or not. But for the memory of the people, the kids who died, it just feels wrong. Now, there is a movie from 2014 called The Town That Dreaded Sundown. However, this is a meta-sequel taking place in 2013. Because of that, I won't be going into this particular film. We still have other things to cover before we end the episode. Why does the story of the Hookman and the dead boyfriend persist? Bill Ellis says that retellings of the story often come from adults remembering stories they were told when they were teens. But he claims that the story has been on the decline since the 70s and early 80s, virtually sinking into obscurity, quote, and that its continued citation as a currently popular legend may be thus naive. I don't know about you, but I was told this story when I was a kid by my peers, so I can't say I agree with him. But let's figure out why the story still draws breath. We have a fascinating cycle between the urban legends and these films. The Texarkana Moonlight Murders took place in the 40s. For the next 30 years, the Hookman and dead boyfriend urban legends arose and circulated for decades, quite probably constructed from those murders. In 1976, The Town That Dreaded Sundown appears, with dialogue that's almost identical to the conversations in those urban legends. None of this dialogue is found around the Texarkana Moonlight Murders, so it must have come from the urban legend. I'm sure this revitalized the legend, as we got a meta-sequel in 2014. And so we have the 1946 murders creating the spark, the urban legends being inspired by those crimes. Those urban legends are so influential in the culture that they inspire the dialogue in the very accurate movie recreation of the crimes. If the movie didn't outright start the slasher genre, it certainly inspired the movies that did, particularly Halloween and Friday the 13th Part 2. If you look at the killers for both of these films, they have masks extraordinarily close to the killers in The Town That Dreaded Sundown. The Town That Dreaded Sundown pulled the urban legend into the culture of horror, providing a blueprint for future movies. Then the movie became an annual staple within the town where the crimes happened. True crime podcasts start to pick up and retell the Moonlight Murders. Whether those podcasts mention the connection to the urban legend or not, I argue that the story is close enough to the urban legend to still feel familiar to listeners. And now you have the movies and TV shows that directly reference the urban legends, some of which being quite recent. And now, here we are. But as it turns out, the Texarkana Moonlight Murders weren't even close to the first true crime case to at least get the ball rolling, and it was hardly the last Lover's Lane killing. Charles Barr prowled Lover's Lanes back in 1923. He'd walk up to a car, kill the man in the driver's seat, and enact violence on the woman before killing her and robbing them both. He earned the nickname the Petting Party Bandit and was caught because of all the items he'd been pawning at nearby shops. In November of 1960, Larry Payton was found stabbed to death in his car at a Lover's Lane. His girlfriend Beverly Allen was found a month and a half later. The infamous Zodiac Killer in the 60s attacked couples David Arthur Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, Michael Mageau and Darlene Ferrin, all at Lover's Lanes. He did also attack Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard at Lake Berryessa. Though this wasn't really a Lover's Lane, the killer wore a black executioner's hood, visually quite similar to the white sack that the Texarkana Killer wore. Monday, May 11th, 1970. The car of David Sloan was found in a ravine at a Lover's Lane, known as 10 Mile Flat. Inside the trunk, they found the bodies of Cheryl Benham and David Sloan. They'd attended a party at the Sigma Alpha Epsilon fraternity house at the University of Oklahoma just 2 days before. Both had been shot 10 times, each, with a .22 caliber rifle. February 12, 1971. Patricia Mann and Jesse McBain attended a Valentine's Day dance at Watts Hospital in Orange County, North Carolina. But their families and Patricia Mann's roommate went to the police when they didn't return. 4 days later, McBain's friend found their car at a lover's lane near Wayside Place. It wouldn't be until the 24th that a surveyor would find the couple's bodies tied to a tree. And that's as far as I'm gonna go. All of these cases are terrible, but this one has cruelty that stands out in the worst way. There's a series of murders and shootings called the Atlanta Lover's Lane Murders, which happened from January to March in 1977. There's also an unsolved set of murders from 1990 called the Lover's Lane Murder. The reason I include all of these cases is to convey that the fear of being attacked at a lover's lane wasn't an unrealistic one, and that there were numerous deaths that contributed to a general boogeyman for decades. The Texarkana Moonlight Murders may have allowed the Hookman and the dead boyfriend killer to manifest in the form of an urban legend, but it was the previous cases that allowed him to fully materialize, the future cases that sustained him, and the horror movies that immortalized the killer. And now you have people like me, doing our best to peel the urban legends apart, to understand them, and to track this son of a bitch down. Speaking of, as we go back to the urban legends in general, we should talk about how cautionary tales are viewed. Cautionary tales are often treated with disdain or disinterest by teenagers and adults who want to be perceived as grounded and unbothered. And yet, these same stories are the narratives that we all know since childhood, passed across decades for generations. As much as the story doesn't scare you, you're still retelling it, from your own reactive memories, and because you're looking for that stunned, fearful reaction from your audience. And if we look at the story itself, the plot is one that's so clean, so tidy, that it's almost a, quote, testimony to the story's near impossibility. After all, what are the odds that a convicted criminal or crazed maniac would be fitted with a hook for a missing hand? That this same threatening figure would show up precisely when a radio warning had been broadcast of his escape, and that the couple would drive away rapidly just at the instant the Hookman put his hook through the door handle. Besides, why wouldn't he try to open the door with his good hand? And how is it that the boy, furious at the interruption of their lovemaking, is still willing to go around politely to open the girl's door when they get home? Too much, but it makes a great story. Here's another part of my interview with folklorist Heather Joseph Witham. I told her that I traced the Hookman and the dead boyfriend back to the Texarkana Moonlight Murders, but was there an earlier crime that fulfilled the main points of the legend?
No, I don't know if there's an earlier one. Could be an earlier one that wasn't related to a real event, but I mean, that story came up because that's the era when suddenly cars are accessible to regular people. It's not going to be too much earlier because only wealthy people really had cars too much earlier. So it's not going to be a young man with one.
I'd never considered this before. The story has to stay within the bounds of commercially available cars. So, unless there's a horse and buggy version, it has to be within the early to mid 1900s. But then we have to narrow it down even further to when cars weren't strictly a luxury item. But I think the accessibility to a car keeps this story relatable. Makes, models, and price points may change, but teenagers will always look forward to the day they obtain the physical representation of their budding adult freedom. But this means that teenagers will start to make adult choices, which makes everyone nervous. And so, we end up with urban legends like the babysitter and the man upstairs, the Hookman, and the dead boyfriend.
stories about things that are relevant to us. So if, a cell phone or a car or whatever is relevant, then those things are going to be the site of the stories. So, because you have to relate to it, you have to worry about it, you have to be thinking about it. So, those things are going to be there.
We continued our conversation, and I said, "But why are we still telling this story? Kids don't exactly go to lovers' lanes and listen to swing jazz on the radio anymore."
But you imagine someone else does in some other town, and maybe they do. And, there's a concept that a very famous early 20th century anthropologist wrote about. Her name was Ruth Benedict, and she lived and researched among the Zuni for a year or two, as I recall, and wrote about their mythology. And I remember her talking about some of the stories, like people in some of the tales, people were using stone knives, when in fact, no, nobody was using stone knives. They had metal knives, of course. Or people would climb up a ladder and go into the house through a roof, which was an old way of building that nobody was still building, and nobody was doing this anymore. And she called that concept cultural lag. She said, there's a cultural lag in a lot of these stories, that sometimes traditional elements seem to be such an intrinsic part of the narrative that they remain. And so that could be part of it too.
And I suppose that's the crux of it. The concepts, the fears, the societal issues have all been around since time immemorial. This connects us to the past, to a time that feels different on the surface. When it comes to parts of the story that are more dated, a la lovers' lanes, sock hops, the cars specifically, etc., I think we keep those extra details because it preserves these stories in the romanticized memory of decades like the 50s. While main points of the story are basic enough to be timeless, preserving more dated elements, such as language or slang used in the dialogue, is a way to both preserve that time period, and perhaps a way to keep the story at arm's length. Decades stand between you and this crazed killer, so this couldn't possibly happen to you. As long as kids sneak away to find a quiet place to fool around, I think some iteration of this story will exist. When kids wander away from the safety of trusted adults and explore the dire consequences of adult choices, there will always be a boogeyman to scare them back into the light of their sheltered homes. And so we close the chapter on the Hookman and the dead boyfriend. Next, we have an urban legend that's laid the groundwork for what would become the backbone of the slasher genre, the spine of the films that most of us are watching in the last week of October. Although the legend seems tied to landlines, a tether that we've been freed from with the invention of smartphones, nevertheless, one question remains as terrifying as it ever was.